Welcome back everyone to part 2 of the reproductive system, and in this part we're going to be looking at the female reproductive system. Learning objectives for this part are to be able to list the functions of the female reproductive system, be able to list the essential and accessory organs and give the function of each, be able to describe the structure and the two functions of the ovaries, be able to discuss the development of the oocyte and the follicle, be able to identify the structure and functions of the uterus, as well as the location, structure, and primary functions of the vagina, be able to identify the structures that together constitute the female external genitalia, and finally be able to describe the structures of the breasts and the mechanisms controlling lactation. Now, in terms of functions of the female reproductive system, like the male one, to produce offspring and ensure continuity of the genetic code, to produce the female gamete, which is the secondary oocyte or the ovum that may unite with the male gamete, so the sperm cell, to form the first cell of an offspring, being the zygote. And then there is additional stuff to provide protection and nutrition to the developing offspring for up to several years after conception. So obviously the female reproductive system provides an environment for the developing embryo and fetus, and that environment being the uterus. And of course, then, the mother, through the provision of breast milk, will provide, nutrition for the newborn baby and, for up to several years later. The components of the female reproductive system then are the female reproductive organs, so the ovaries. So these are the female gonads, the paired right and left ovaries that produce the female gamete, being the ova or the oocyte. Then we have the uterine tubes, and these are and other ducts or modified duct structures. So the uterine tubes or the oviducts or the fallopian tubes. We also have the uterus and we have the vagina. Now together, the ovaries, the uterine tubes, the uterus and the vagina are sometimes collectively called the internal genitals. Then we have the external genital organs, including the clitoris, the labia minora and majora. And not shown on this slide, of course, are the mammary glands. And these are additional glands that secrete milk. Mammary glands secrete this milk to provide nourishment for the developing offspring or baby. When we look at a lateral view of the female reproductive system, you can see that the urinary bladder and the urethra are anterior to the uterus and the vagina, and the uterus and the vagina are anterior to the rectum and the anus. And the ovaries themselves are about 2 to 3 centimeters. They're superior to the uterus and connected by the uterine tube. Now we are going to start with the ovaries and their associated ligaments. You can see here that the ovaries are located on either side of the uterus. They're very tiny. They're about the size of an almond and they weigh about 3 grams. You can see here this broad ligament. It's an extension of the peritoneum and it spreads out on both sides of the uterus. And the ovaries and the uterine tubes or the fallopian tubes or the oviducts are attached as well. Now, in terms then of ligaments, we can't see the mesovarium here, but it attaches the ovary to the posterior surface of this broad ligament. We also have the suspensory ligament, and it contains the ovarian arteries, veins, and nerves. Now, if you look in here or over here, you can see another ligament that's called the ovarian ligament. And it's this ligament where the ovarian arteries, veins, and nerves enter the ovary. Now, the ovaries have coverings. The outermost covering is the ovarian epithelium, and it's part of the visceral peritoneum. Also has the tunica albuginea, which we mentioned in terms of a covering of the testes. And this is a capsule of, white, dense, fibrous connective tissue deep to the epithelium. The ovary consists of 2 main regions, an outer cortex and an inner medulla. The cortex is very dense and it contains follicles with immature female sex cells or those oocytes. Now, once a female reaches puberty, the oocytes and the specialized cells that surround them are present in varying stages of development. And we're going to spend the next few slides talking about this. In the medulla, though, it's much looser, and this is where we find the connective tissue cells, the blood vessels, the nerves, and the lymphatic vessels. And the stroma then is the connective tissue of the ovary. So the ovary functions to produce ova or oocytes, which are the female gametes. And it does this through a process called oogenesis. So the definition of oogenesis is the process that results in the formation of a mature egg. The second function is folliculogenesis, and this is the development of the follicle that contains this oocyte, right? Now, the ovary also functions to produce hormones. So these female sex hormones, especially estrogens and progesterone. And these hormones help to regulate reproductive function in the female, making the ovaries even more essential to female reproductive function. Now down here you can just see some high power microscopy looking at the different stages of these follicles inside the ovaries. And again, we're going to talk about all of this as we move through and what they all mean. Now, oogenesis is the process of oocyte formation. You can see in this figure over here that there's stuff going on in utero, so before the female baby is born, and then after puberty. Now, just like with the male reproductive system, we had spermatogonia. Here we've got oogonia, and the oogonia is this kind of bank of cells from which the oocytes develop. The oogonia contain the diploid number of chromosomes, and they divide via mitosis to produce other oogonia and these primary oocytes. Now, believe it or not, there are 6 to 7 million primary oocytes produced by the 4th month of prenatal life. So we're talking about in utero, when the female fetus is developing. Atrasia, though, then occurs. So we get loss of some of these oocytes via apoptosis or programmed cell death. So that about 2 million of the original 6 to 7 million oocytes begin this first meiotic division, but it stops at prophase. And then nothing else happens until puberty. And then by the time a female reaches puberty, there's about 400,000 primary kind of oocytes at puberty. Then after puberty, every 28 days or so, meiosis 1 resumes, and the oocyte, enters the second phase of meiosis, but arrests at metaphase 2. Okay. At this stage, we've got we've got the haploid number of chromosomes, and this oocyte is said to be the secondary oocyte. Now, you can see in the generation of the secondary oocyte that we also have a polar body, which is much smaller. So all of the, cytoplasm and everything goes into the generation of this secondary oocyte, because this is the one that's going to get ovulated. First polar body, you still have to get rid of, those 23 other chromosomes. So they go in there, and then that kind of splits off to form the second polar bodies. So the oocyte stop, the secondary oocyte then arrests at metaphase 2. And this is before, fertilization occurs. So before sperm penetrates it. And this secondary oocyte is ovulated, right? And usually only one is ovulated and all of the others kind of degenerate. Then if there is, a sperm in the area and fertilization does occur, then that secondary oocyte completes the second stage of meiosis immediately after the sperm penetrates the oocyte. And then what you have is the haploid number of chromosomes in the secondary oocyte and in the sperm coming together to form that diploid zygote. So of the 2 million primary oocytes in the ovaries at birth, only about 400 are ovulated, over the course of, a female's sort of fertile life. So we'll have a look at this again so that everybody gets it. We've got our oogonia containing the diploid number of chromosomes undergoing mitosis. You get daughter cells and this primary oocyte. Now the primary oocyte begins the first meiotic division, which is stopped prenatally, and then it only restarts for a small number of oocytes each monthly cycle when a female reaches puberty. So each month, one oocyte completes the first meiotic division, begins the second, and is ovulated. So it's ovulated here as this secondary oocyte. Okay, you can see it contains the haploid number of chromosomes. Now it will only complete this second phase of meiosis if fertilization occurs. So after fertilization, the second meiotic division completes. Okay, and during this process, 3 sets of haploid chromosomes are discarded as polar bodies, and 1 set then is part of the fertilized zygote, which contains the diploid number of chromosomes, 23 from the sperm cell and 23 there from that secondary oocyte. And that diploid zygote is then going to undergo numerous rounds of mitosis to produce identical daughter cells, and eventually, the production of a new organism, and in this case, a human. So while, you have the generation of these oocytes occurring, you also have folliculogenesis. Now, the follicles, or the ovarian follicles, are the oocytes and their supporting cells. And within the ovaries, you have the existence of these follicles at different stages. Now, remember I said that there were 6 to 7 million of these oocytes, present in the developing fetus. And then what happens over the course of a woman's life is that there is atresia of all of these follicles. So by the time a woman gets to menopause, there are absolutely no follicles left at all. And what you're going to see through the process of this folliculogenesis is the presence of primordial follicles, which develop into primary, secondary, and tertiary follicles. And then, we only get the secondary oocyte forming just prior to ovulation. So the primordial follicle is present in newborn females, and it is sort of the predominant follicle in adulthood as well. With the primordial follicle, which you can see over here, the oocyte is initially surrounded by one layer of flat cells called granulosa cells. However, those granulosa cells start to divide and the follicle gets larger. And then by the time we have this outer layer of cells called the theca cells, we have what's known as a secondary follicle. And these theca cells then will work with the granulosa cells to produce estrogens. With this secondary follicle as well, you can also see the development of this thin sort of membrane here called the zona pellucida, and just hang on to that word because that becomes important during fertilization. In the secondary follicle as well, that estrogen-rich fluid pools around the oocyte in a space here called the antrum. The secondary follicle then sort of develops into this tertiary follicle, and this is also known as a mature follicle or a vesicular follicle or a Graafian follicle. So this follicle then is ready for ovulation, to release that secondary oocyte. A clump of cumulus cells attaches the oocyte to the follicle wall. The cumulus cells secrete another hormone called progesterone, which helps to attract sperm towards the secondary oocyte and promotes sperm motility. Ovulation then is the release of that secondary oocyte or that ovum at the end of oogenesis. And ovulation involves the rupture of the ovarian follicle, which you can see here, and the subsequent release of that secondary oocyte. Once that secondary oocyte has been released, that mature sort of Graafian follicle then forms the yellow body called the corpus luteum. And we will talk about the fate of the corpus luteum in a couple of slides' time. So just kind of summarize some of this terminology. Ovulation is the release of the secondary oocyte from an ovary. Unlike spermatogenesis, the division of the cytoplasm during meiosis is uneven. We do get the generation of those polar bodies that are very small and the one oocyte that's very large. The Graafian follicle, once ovulation has occurred, becomes the corpus luteum, or the yellow body. Fertilization begins when a sperm cell binds the plasma membrane of the secondary oocyte and penetrates into the cytoplasm. The secondary oocyte completes meiosis too only after fertilization occurs. And during this, it forms the last polar body, and the fertilized egg then is now known as the zygote. With the fate of the corpus luteum, if fertilization occurs, the corpus luteum persists and produces progesterone. If it is not fertilized, then it becomes the corpus albicans, or the white body, which will eventually degenerate. And I'll leave you to have a look at this in your own time, but you're looking at, the development of the follicles here, and then in terms then of, the maturation of the oocyte there on the right. We're going to move on now to these fallopian tubes. They're also known as the uterine tubes or the oviducts. And the role of these uterine tubes is to provide nutrients for oocyte or for the embryonic mass. So what you were going to learn here is that sort of at the widest part of the fallopian tube or the uterine tube is where fertilization occurs, and that, generates this embryonic mass. If fertilization doesn't occur, then it will be present as the secondary oocyte. So the role of the uterine tubes is to provide nutrients for either of those. The cells contain cilia, and the cilia move fluid and transport the oocyte, the secondary oocyte or the embryonic mass, through the tube towards the uterus. You can see here that we have these fimbriae. These are long, thin processes that extend from the infundibulum. And the inner surface is ciliated. The infundibulum is open to the peritoneal cavity and adjacent then to the ovaries. And the cilia actually then sweep that fluid into the tube. The uterine tubes contain different layers as well. So we have an outer serosa layer, we have a middle muscularis layer, and then an inner mucosal layer containing that simple ciliated columnar epithelium. Also has these longitudinal folds. And this mesosalpinx up here is part of the broad ligament, which is attached to the tube. The uterus then is a pear-shaped structure, and it has two main parts. We have the body here, which is superior to the cervix part here. And this bulging part of the upper part of the body is known as the fundus. In a female who's never been pregnant, the uterus is pear-shaped. It measures about 7.5 centimeters long, 5 centimeters wide, and 3 centimeters thick. It's located in the pelvic cavity between the urinary bladder and the rectum. Between birth and puberty, the uterus gradually descends from the lower abdomen into the pelvis. And then, once menopause has occurred, the uterus begins a process of involution that results in a decrease in the size of the organ, and also it kind of gains a position deep in the pelvis. Several ligaments hold the uterus in place but allows some movement. There are 8 uterine ligaments. So we have 2 uterosacral ligaments, 2 broad ligaments, a posterior ligament, an anterior ligament, and 2 round ligaments. The uterus wall is composed of 3 layers. We have a perimetrium, which is a serous membrane. We have a middle myometrium, and as its name suggests, it contains smooth muscle. And then an inner endometrium, which is a mucous membrane. You can see it here. We zoom in on it here. Now, the endometrium contains 2 layers itself. It also has these simple tubular glands that obviously are going to secrete fluid. The functional layer is the innermost layer, and this is the layer of the endometrium that is replaced monthly during the menstrual cycle. And then we have a basal layer, which is the deepest, and it's the closest then to the myometrium. Okay. The cervix then is a more rigid and less contractile, so it doesn't stretch as easily as the rest of the uterus. The cervical canal is lined with mucus glands, and a mucus plug exists sort of all throughout the menstrual cycle except near ovulation, when the consistency of the secretion changes and it becomes more liquid. And that makes sense, right? Because ovulation's about to occur, and and potentially fertilization if there are sperm cells around. A pap smear then, many of you in the class may have had a pap smear, collects loose epithelial cells and can be used then for early detection of cervical carcinoma. But I'm sure that nearly everybody, all females in the class, and males for that matter, have probably been vaccinated against HPV. Started with vaccinating females, but now males get it as well to prevent transmission of that virus, human papilloma virus, that is linked to cervical cancer. And of course, the name of that vaccine is Gardasil. In terms of functions of the uterus, they include, because the uterus is part of the reproductive tract, it permits sperm to ascend towards the uterine tubes for fertilization to occur. If conception does occur, then the offspring develops in the uterus. The embryo is supplied with nutrients by endometrial glands until a placenta is produced. The placenta is itself is an organ that permits the exchange of materials between the offspring's blood and the maternal blood, and we'll talk about that much more in the final recording for this topic. And of course, during gestation or development of the embryo and the fetus, no myometrial contractions occur. The vagina then is the female organ of copulation or sexual intercourse. It's a collapsible tube. It's about 8 to 10 centimeters long, but it is capable of great stretch or distension. It has a dual function, so it allows for menstrual flow and also for childbirth. The hymen is a mucous membrane that covers the vaginal opening or orifice early in life. And the vaginal wall is very muscular, and it contains a mucous membrane lining, and that is moist, stratified squamous epithelium to protect against abrasion. The walls also contain, longitudinal columns and transverse rugae, and it's these rugae then that can kind of, unfold or stretch out to allow for that distension of the vagina. The fornix then is that part of the vagina that is the superior domed portion, which is attached to the sides of the cervix. Now looking at the female external genitalia, and the perineum is that region that contains the muscles and the fascia that surround and support these structures and form the pelvic floor. Now, in terms of the external genitalia, it's known as the vulva or the pudendum, or the external female genitalia, right? We have here the vestibule. The vestibule is the space between the labia minora, and it contains the urethral and the vaginal openings. We also have the clitoris. The clitoris is the erectile structure in the female. The glans clitoris itself is covered with highly sensitive skin that's involved in sexual stimulation that produces the female sexual response. So this is sort of, the clitoris is very homologous to the penis in the male. It contains erectile tissue, so corpora cavernosa that is expanded at the basis to form the crus of the clitoris, and also corpora spongiosa on either side then of the vaginal orifice. The vaginal orifice itself is surrounded by erectile tissue, so the bulb of the vestibule or the corpus spongiosum, and also glands. And the labia majora may meet at the pudendal cleft and cover deeper structures, and they unite anteriorly then to form the mons pubis. And finally, to the mammary glands. These are, of course, the organs of milk production, and they're located within the mammae or the breasts. They consist of glandular lobes and adipose tissue. They're supported by these suspensory ligaments called Cooper ligaments. And they support the breast through attachment to fascia of the pectoralis major. And of course, at puberty, once estrogens and progesterone start to be secreted, this controls breast development. So here you can see, that each breast consists of several lobes separated by septa of connective tissue. The lobes themselves consist of several lobules composed of connective tissue embedded with pouches of these milk secreting cells called alveoli. And the lactiferous duct then from each lobe will converge towards the nipple. And it's that suckling then of the nipple by the newborn baby or even an older baby that will then stimulate that milk. Now, the nipples are surrounded by areola, and those areola contain these Montgomery glands. And these Montgomery glands have a secretion that is oily. So it's lubricating, so it's very good for breastfeeding, and it also is antibacterial as well. So I guess the oil does serve a really important function in moistening and protecting the nipples during breastfeeding. And I guess it's for this reason that breastfeeding mothers are told, kind of not to wash off their nipples with soap while they're breastfeeding. And of course, you can see that there are huge variations there in areola color. So of course, the function of the mammary glands are for lactation to occur. Ovarian hormones make the breast structurally ready to secrete milk. When the baby is born and there's a shedding of the placenta, that cuts off a major source of estrogens. And estrogens suppress prolactin during pregnancy. So once the estrogens are shut off, the prolactin then stimulates milk synthesis. And remember, oxytocin stimulates the myoepithelial cells then to eject milk. So the prolactin involved in milk synthesis and the oxytocin then involved in milk letdown. What is the importance of lactation? Well, it does have several advantages. Provides nutrients for the newborn, also allows for passive immunities from the maternal immune system, and from those antibodies go into the milk and are then present in that first secretion, which is called colostrum, and then in the subsequent milk. And so that provides the baby with protection while their own immune system is developing. And also really important, lactation in forming an emotional bond between the mother and the child. And so this diagram just sort of summarizes the whole mechanism controlling lactation. We've got this mechanical suckling of the baby on the nipple that triggers sensory nerve impulses in the areola. The brain receives that information, and so do the lactocytes. The lactocytes produce milk, and the brain then will cause, the release of oxytocin then from the posterior pituitary gland. Oxytocin then triggers the myoepithelial cells to squeeze the milk from the alveoli, so it drains into the lactiferous ducts, and then that milk sort of pools in the lactiferous sinuses before being discharged through the nipple pores. Okay, everybody, I have finished this part of the topic, and when I come back, we're going to be looking at hormonal regulation of the female reproductive system.